Hello. Renee is exceptional in many ways. I know many of you are looking for summer internships, and was it just a year ago that you were? And she went off for an internship and came back as a CTO and co-founder, and has kept working with Brioxy. Really made a tremendous difference, and I think her talk will be very different from Colin's, and interesting in very different ways. So I'll turn things over to Renee.
Hi. Thank you, Noah, and thank you, CS Department, and thank you to everybody for spending your afternoon here. Like Ellen said, I'm Renee. I am in the ICS program, and I'm also the CTO and co-founder of Brioxy. And what I'm hoping to talk about here is just a little bit about what Brioxy is and how it got started, and a lot about what went into building Brioxy.com and what continues to go into it. So to start out, our story begins with Cole, and that's Cole. Cole is the founder and CEO of Brioxy. And she's also a Mills alum in addition to a million other things. She founded the Brown Boy Project, which is a really interesting organization redefining conversations about masculinity in communities of color. She's also a graduate of the London School of Economics, an Echoing Green Fellow, a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholar, and a nationally known life coach, and she could not be here today. Unfortunately, she's on the East Coast. So Cole has 15 years of experience working with young people in life planning, career advancement, and leadership development, and has a special focus on first-gen students and students of color. She's worked for a number of years with the SAW program at Mills, if anybody's heard of that. And so just a quick background about me. Prior to getting into CS, I kind of had a background in teaching and education and a long-standing interest in making college more accessible to more people. And I've been looking for ways to combine CS with my interest in education and education reform. So the origins of Brioxy stem from the fact that Cole, in all of her work, recognized that lots of first-gen students and students of color that had lots of potential lacked access to the resources and social capital necessary to successfully compete for prestigious fellowships, internships, and other door-opening opportunities. And what she wanted was a way to expand her on-the-ground work and her one-on-one mentoring to help students navigate the educational and professional landscapes. And she wanted to just expand it to a much larger audience. So that's where the idea for Brioxy came from. This is the most recent version of my elevator pitch. I try not to include full sentences on slides, but I figured I'd just throw the whole elevator pitch on. So Brioxy is a collaborative online resource to find and obtain top fellowships, adventures, and travel opportunities, combined with an integrated to-do list system to manage application deadlines and other life tasks. And some of those features are more implemented right now than others, but that's kind of the long-term or immediate-term goal. And even though the site's available to everyone, because of Cole's and my interest in the site, we're trying to really make it speak to that first generation and young people of color population by just including experiences and advice that are kind of catered to them. And so the way I got involved, I included a nice diagram, is Cole contacted Barbara Lasanti, who she knew through the SAW program, because she had this idea for a big website but didn't know a lot of people who knew how to make websites, and asked Barbara if she knew anybody in the CS department who might be interested. So she put us in touch. We grabbed lunch at the tea shop in April 2014. Really hit it off. She explained what she wanted to do. I thought it sounded awesome, and we kind of went from there. So my role in the site basically was to single-handedly architect, build, deploy, and manage the site. Just that. So within that, I had to research and make all web stack decisions, so just how we wanted to actually build the site and what tools to use. I also, starting in September, now oversee 2 Mills interns who perform user research, contribute to UI, and facilitate Brioxy events. One of those interns is here right now, Gloria. She is awesome. And so I started out working as an intern, or in terms of taxes, as a contractor over the summer of 2014. And that went well, and Cole asked me to come on as co-founder and CTO in August of 2014. Right, and so when we were starting out, after these initial conversations, the big question on my mind was, how do you go about building a website? And within that question are kind of like 3 core questions that we just continue to come back to. The first of those being like, what features need to be implemented for the website? And like, when do those features need to be implemented? Like, if we have a whole bunch of things we want to do, like, how should we prioritize what needs to happen first? And just how should we set those deadlines? And then how should it be implemented? Like, how should the back end, so like the server-side code, how should that be designed? And how should the front end and UI experience work? In addition to that, like I kind of mentioned, an ongoing question is like, what are the most appropriate tools to use for what we're trying to do? And then finally, like, how will we get feedback about this site? And so there's kind of 2 types of feedback that you want to worry about, like qualitative. So like, if a user tells me like, hey, I can't actually log into your site, there's something wrong, it takes me to an error page, that would be an example of qualitative feedback. Quantitative feedback is more like, what are our site traffic patterns? Like, how many users are we getting, how many page hits? How are users engaging with this site? Like, who's actively using the features and who just like logged in once and was never seen again? So just finding ways to answer all of those questions. So when I first started working on the site, I needed to figure out what tools and languages we wanted to use. And basically another word for figuring out tools and languages is figuring out the web stack. And at first I wasn't even totally sure what was meant by a web stack. I would have friends asking me like, what's your stack? I was thinking like data structures stack. But it turns out a web stack is just a way of talking about the technologies, languages, and operating system used to build a website. And I found this nice kind of idyllic picture of a web stack online. And it starts with like the operating system. Can you guys read that? It's like kind of blurry. Like the operating system, the database, like the web server, server-side code, browser, and client code. So those are kind of the layers of the stack. And what eventually became Brioxy's stack, at the heart of it was Ruby on Rails, which in terms of this diagram kind of falls under like server-side code and also like interacts with the database. Ruby on Rails, the site is deployed to Heroku, which is a platform as a service, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So Heroku kind of took care of like all of the red and orange layers. Everything is deployed there. The site also uses Google Analytics and New Relics for like site traffic and analytics, and I'd say that kind of counts as server-side code. So stuff that actually gets loaded onto the browser, like onto the client's page, because it's a JavaScript script. It also used Amazon Web Services S3 for like storing static assets, just because it was cheaper than storing those assets on Heroku. I used the mini-test testing framework, and I'll talk about why in a minute. And I also used Haml, Sass, CoffeeScript, and Bootstrap for the front end, which are just kind of nicer to work with versions of like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Right, so to go into a little more detail, why did we use Ruby on Rails? First and foremost, because Ruby on Rails is known for helping a team to get started quickly. And part of the reason it's so good for getting started quickly is because it has a very structured model view controller framework, which I think some of you are probably familiar with just from like Almeda's class and other like the software engineering class. But basically, it's a way of like separating the concerns of the app. So you have like a controller, your model, and your views. And then the idea is if there's like somebody using Chrome and they want to like look at a list of their tasks on a to-do list, they would send that request to the Rails router. So they like click on the link that displays all of your tasks. The router would send that request to the controller, say, hey controller, this is what they want. And then the controller would talk to the model and be like, we need a list of all of those tasks. Can you send me a list of all of those tasks? The model then goes and queries the database to get that list of like corresponding tasks for that user, sends it back to the model sends it back to the controller grabs the view that's associated with that request, sticks in whatever data the model had, and then sends it back to the client's page. Basically, it's like a high-level overview of kind of how the MVC framework works. So that's what Rails has. And like one of the benefits of it is it helps to keep the project organized, which is especially valuable because I hadn't really like worked with Rails at all before this project, so it kind of offloaded a lot of the design decisions that I otherwise would have just had to make on my own. They're already decided for you. And all of that just leads to fast prototyping. It's really easy to get something that works up relatively quickly. Another nice thing about Rails is that it's pretty well integrated with testing. So there's like an established part of the Rails project that is reserved for testing, and depending on how the project is configured, it'll automatically generate associated tests, like whenever you create a new controller or a new model. I wasn't great about testing at the beginning, but once I started testing, it was very useful to have that. Rails also has a very robust open source community, both in terms of lots of documentation and tutorials for beginners, and also just tons of libraries and plugins, or what are known as gems, in Rails world. It also has like really good default security, again, because it's so structured, so you kind of have to go out of your way to like make the site less secure. And so one of the criticisms of Rails is that it doesn't scale as well, and it's not as performance, it's just not as fast as some other like stacks you might use. But that's more generally the case when you have a lot of users and a really big site. And Cole and I both agreed that if we ever ran into that problem, like, we probably have the resources in place to deal with it, because it would mean that we had a lot of users, which would actually be a great problem to have. So we figured for the time being, Rails was our best option. And so why Heroku then? So we had our like whole framework, and so the way the server-side code would work, we needed to find a place to actually host it. So Heroku was where I decided to do that. So Heroku is a platform as a service. Man, I don't know why I'm so thirsty today.
She's hot today.
So a platform as a service basically just automates all the stuff involved in hosting your app on servers. So if you need more servers, you can pay, and it will automatically distribute your app to additional servers. It takes care of a lot of the stuff that would be a pain for you to manage otherwise. And so I use it, first of all, because Brioxy didn't own a bunch of its own servers, so we went elsewhere. And also because it was just really well integrated with Rails and Git. I think, at least last time I checked, the creator of Ruby actually works at Heroku, Mats. Heroku also has really good documentation for like accomplishing different things, and it easily scales, and it has a number of like really useful add-ons. It's just very user-friendly. So I used Haml for HTML and embedded Ruby, mostly just because I like how it looks a lot more. So you can kind of compare. This is like the standard way you can write HTML code in Ruby in Rails, and I just think this looks a lot cleaner. So that was why I used Haml, and it was kind of the same reason I used Sass and CoffeeScript. I used Minitest as my testing framework because it was just the easiest one to get started with. It was included in the project. It was a lot more familiar to me because it looked like JUnit, and it just included the different kinds of testing I would want to do. So that is an example of an integration test, which is a test that kind of simulates how a user would actually interact with the site. So this test just makes sure that if a user tries to log in with valid information, it'll take them to the page where they're supposed to go, which is actually something that I broke when implementing an additional feature, and then this test came out of me not wanting that to happen again. Right, okay, so once I had decided on the set of tools and languages that we wanted to use on the site, I had to actually start implementing the features. And so those core features kind of changed over the course of the past year, which I think is pretty typical for a startup. But one of the obvious features is we wanted to have users and accounts that they were able to log into. We wanted to have a time management system or a to-do list that had some very specific requirements that Cole wanted. We wanted a fellowships page, which is a list of like sortable, searchable, and filterable fellowships, which is what I've been working on more recently. This kind of took a back burner because it takes a lot of time to make good videos, but another idea we have for the site is a place where we can upload videos of both Cole and other like successful young people of color just giving advice about how to navigate the system, whether it's like the college system or the professional system. So that's kind of still a work in progress. I hope it ends up happening because I think it could be cool. And we also wanted an analytics page, both to manage site content, so uploading the stuff that I mentioned above, and also just to track site traffic and usage. Cool. So those were all the things we wanted to implement. And so starting out was no small feat because I really had pretty much no web development experience when I started out. So my first step was to learn how the internet and Rails worked. And I used a lot of resources to accomplish that, but this tutorial by Michael Hartle really kind of saved the whole project. It's just like an excellent tutorial. It's like a whole book, but it's free online. And I pretty much just worked through the entire book to build the skeleton project for Brioxy. Railscasts are these series of screencasts by this guy named Ryan Bates. I think he did either between 300 or 400 of these screencasts. And they're a little outdated because I think he got burnt out on making so many screencasts, but they're extremely helpful. And then obviously Stack Overflow. And those three classes, even though they didn't immediately relate to Rails development, were just really helpful in terms of picking things up. So once I got the initial Rails project up and running, working on Heroku with nothing interesting to look at all, I started just with the static pages for the site. So things like the homepage, the FAQ, and the about. And so that just involved creating the views associated with those pages and managing them under just a page controller. So there's no database or backend component for that because there was nothing that really needed to be remembered about these pages because they were static. And so these pages were built with Bootstrap templates, wireframes provided by a friend of Cole's who was a professional designer, and a lot of patience because CSS isn't the most forgiving tool to work with. So that's just kind of an example of how a couple of those static pages look on the actual site now. So then the first more complex component that I implemented was building users, and for that I very closely followed Hartle's tutorial. This is from the database schema, so it just kind of gives you a sense of what fields are included in the user. They're pretty standard. The reason this is a password digest is because it gets encrypted before being added to the database, because otherwise I'd be able to see everybody's password, and so would hackers, so we didn't want that. So the email validation is pretty simple right now. It just uses a regex, so a regular expression, to make sure that somebody's not using a really weird format to create an email address. The one thing that it doesn't check right now that I really want to add soon is a way to make sure that it's an actual email address that somebody uses, because there's a lot of weird looking email addresses in there right now because it doesn't actually send an email to the user to verify that this is your real email address. So that was a bit of an oversight, but it will be added. Anyways, so once I had built the user model, which uses that kind of backend, the views in the controller, the site was able to allow a user to create, edit, and delete a Brioxy account, but signing in was a separate type of implementation. So to sign in users, the reason why that's kind of challenging is because HTTP, the protocol that you use to kind of send stuff back and forth on the internet that we're used to, has no native way to remember that a user is logged in. So it's stateless. You send one request to the server, sends it back, and then it has no idea who you are really for the next request. Which doesn't work when you're trying to have the sense that a user is logged into their account and doing a lot of continuous actions. So the solution is to create a session controller combined with the cookies that your browser can use to kind of keep track of you, to maintain a sense of continuity across a Brioxy session. And so there's a lot of existing libraries to do that kind of authorization. I think the most popular one is Devise. But because I wanted to kind of understand what was actually going on rather than just sticking in an authorization system, I ended up kind of making our own. And it was again modeled very heavily after Hartle's tutorial. Okay, So at that point, we had a way for users to make an account, sign in, but didn't really have anything for them to look at, so I started working on a to-do list. And this is a GIF. I was very excited to discover that you can add GIFs to a Google presentation. So there's going to be a few of them here because I'm not carried away. But so this is how the to-do list system looks now. So I mean, right now it's adding a new date to a task, and it's going to update so that that new task is within the week that it got updated to. And now it's going to say done. That task disappears. I know it's kind of hard to see, but it's now in the completed task section. So there's 3 columns. This should say, yeah, I guess GIFs make it kind of blurry, but it should say like tasks this week, future tasks, and they're organized by like month. So this says like May 2015, and then it says like week 1, and then it tells you like what those dates are, and then it has tasks for that week. And then this should say bucket list, so it's like stuff you know you want to do someday, but you don't know exactly when. And so the reason it was designed that way was because that's actually the to-do list system that Cole, back when she was an undergrad student at Mills, started using by hand, like in a book, to just keep herself more organized. And she said it like just changed her life, and she like kind of spreads the word about this type of to-do list system to like people during her trainings and stuff. So she really wanted to build an online version of that to-do list that she used. So this is kind of the final product that came out of that brainstorming and that work. It was one of the more complicated components of the site to build. The complicated part was not on the back end. Like you can look at the database schema there, it looks pretty straightforward. A task belongs to a user, and a user can have many tasks, so it's like a many-to-one relationship. So that part was pretty straightforward. And I kind of covered all of these already, but the requirements for the to-do list were to like display those 3 columns, an ability to add a new task, which you can see, like, man, GIF is not doing what I want. Right, so up there, right, that's how you add a new task. And then a way to edit and delete a task, so maybe it's doing that right now. Nope, it's just not ordering the way I want. And a way to tab between the current task and the completed task, a way to drag and drop tasks between columns and to reorder them. And then when a user attempts to add a task to the future tasks column, we needed to have a way for them to select what week and what month and what year that task should be associated with. So there's a lot of thought that went into like figuring out what that like user experience should look like what's an easy way for somebody to do that. And that was that modal, the pop-up that you saw to kind of prompt them through that. And so in addition to all that, you don't want to just have it changed on the like screen when the user's doing it. You need to update all of these changes to the database so it's remembered. And so the hard part was really the JavaScript involved in this, so like being able to drag and drop the tasks and then update them. And this is the only code I put in the project, but it was a pretty important method and it took me a long time to develop. So this is the method that deals with kind of all the dragging and sorting between the task columns. So it's kind of long, but it should be pretty easy to follow. So the idea is you have an old list, which is like where a task originates. The new list variable, which is where it eventually gets dropped. Item corresponds to the like DOM object that the task information is contained within. And bucket list state is just a like constant that I set elsewhere and I'm accessing here. So the idea is we have these 3 connected lists that are like those 3 columns that you saw. The current task, the bucket list, and the future tasks. And I like used a jQuery library called sortable. So that method gets called on all 3 of those div elements. And those 3 elements are connected with the connected list class. So that's just a way to know like those are the 3 columns that I should be able to drag the task between. And don't worry about this line. But so then within this sortable method, there's a number of different events that can happen. So if a user picks up a task, so you like click on it and try to drag it somewhere, the start event is triggered. When the start event is triggered, it says the item that we're dragging is this item. And we set the new list and the old list to wherever you picked it up from. So if you grab a task out of like the current tasks column, both of these would be set to current tasks. So then if I'm dragging it over to like the future weeks column, as soon as it hovers over that new column, the change event is triggered. And when that's triggered, the new list variable gets set to whatever I'm now dragging it over. And so then if I decide that I want to drop it into that column, the stop event gets triggered. And as soon as the stop event gets triggered, that's when it gets a little more interesting. So I grab the ID of the task that I've been dragging around. And then if the new list that I dragged it into is future tasks, I call this helper method, which prompts the user to set the week. So that's how that pop-up gets triggered. And then within this method is a way to kind of update the backend. I didn't include that method, but that's kind of where that backend happens. And then if the new list is current tasks, I have another helper method that takes that task ID and sets its state to today. And then other ones, I assume that they try to drag it to the bucket list column. And so then I set the task ID to bucket list and update the database accordingly. So that was kind of the cleanest way I could figure out how to implement this method without resorting to a JavaScript framework, which is long-term, I think, what might be a better option for this project. So those are like other MVC frameworks that help you to kind of keep your JavaScript a little better organized. Right, so then the rest of the project was a little less complicated in terms of front end. I implemented the Brioxy hacks, which is a way to view those videos. So you can see the back end of that. It's another GIF. So you go to the Brioxy hacks. There's two ways to view the video thumbnail. So you click on it, the video starts playing. So that was a lot more straightforward than the to-do list. Yeah. And it again, right now, it just has like filler videos, but eventually we want to add some custom content there. Same kind of idea with the fellowships portal as the Brioxy hacks. So right now we have a list of different fellowships that we've added to the site. When you click on a fellowship, it pops up detailed information about that fellowship. What we want to add long term is something that you see on a lot of sites like Coursera, where you can have different categories. So like, who does this fellowship apply to? And you can kind of select what you're interested in, and it will filter accordingly. So that's what I've been working on lately. It's been a little challenging, but I think we'll get there. And because I want to include this functionality where it groups it by like categories, this is kind of how the back end of the task looks. So there are many categories, kind of like what you see here in bold. And then a category can have many opportunities, an opportunity can have many categories. And I might revise how this works because field isn't really a very good name for a database table. But so that's kind of where the fellowships portal is right now. Right now you can look at them and sort them and filter them. But we want to add a lot more functionality there. But so what we came to realize, once you want to add content, so like the Brioxy hacks and the fellowships, when you want to add content like that directly to the site, that means there needs to be a way to add and delete that content. And you obviously don't want all users to be able to mess with that content, so you need to have a concept of an admin versus regular user. So to make that distinction, I added a Boolean admin attribute to the user model, and I also needed to restrict access to the pages that should be admin only. And that just involves modifying like the permissions in your controller, so like how it decides what data will be sent. So this is an example of how the admin section looks for managing content. So this navigation panel only happens if you're an admin user. And so there's a way to like search opportunities or fellowships, edit them and delete them. And then there's also different tabs for more like analytics, updating the Brioxy hacks, and just more user-specific analytics there. All right, which brings me to evaluation and analytics and user feedback. So I kind of already mentioned the custom analytics, where you saw the tabs on that last page. But so the custom analytics that I designed just were pretty basic and were to address like who are our users and how are they engaging with the site, like how many tasks are they adding to the to-do list, like are they logging in more than once, like how many users are we getting week over week. And then, so I think that's what I say here, right? So it tracks the weekly sign-up rate. Currently we have about 400 users, which isn't bad, but it doesn't really demonstrate the kind of traction that we would need to like qualify for like incubators or accelerators, like Y Combinator, so we're still working on it. And also it tracks like user engagement, so people who are logging in a lot and people who are using the to-do list heavily. And so kind of using those metrics, we have about like 40 active users, and we'd really like to see that number increase, but I think that just involves adding more interesting content to the site, which is what we're working on. And I should say track. So eventually we will track engagement with those other features once we make them more interesting to use. Right, and so then I also integrated Google Analytics into the site, which like tells you more generally like what traffic looks like. And so this is just kind of an overview of like what the traffic has looked like from August 2014 to now. I added Google Analytics in September 2014. And so since then we've had 4,600 sessions, which is just like a time that you're using the site. So you like log in, or you just look at the site, you look at a couple pages, and then you leave, that counts as the session. We've had almost 2,000 unique users in that time, and almost 17,000 page hits, which I think is pretty cool. This like spike in January that you see corresponds to when we had an article come out in Wired.com, which was really interesting to watch because you look at like a more detail level graph and it just goes like, and then there's like a couple of after waves, I think, because people like look at it the next few days. So that was really interesting to see. This other spike, I think Cole emailed a bunch of people, and so it's just interesting to see like when things happen in the world, it like affects the site traffic, which makes sense, but it's cool to watch. Okay, so that brings me to future plans. I'm trying to wrap up by like 5:30, right? Okay. And as Ellen mentioned, potential opportunity for a summer internship. Right, so we're planning to continue adding a lot of the features that I've touched on before. There are a lot of things we still want to do on the task. One thing is to integrate the to-do list with the fellowship list too. So if you see a fellowship you like, being able to like add it to your to-do list with like the corresponding deadline so you don't forget about it. We want to add, to make it like a real community platform, which I think is one of the most exciting potential features, we want to add like a kind of Yelp-like review-ish discussion platform within each individual like fellowship listing, so that people can kind of talk about the application process, like kind of like how the computer science club kept meeting to talk about Grace Hopper, like just like an online version of that. And kind of in that same vein, we want to add a way for users to like message each other and network with each other, so kind of like a light social networking component. I want better testing coverage because it just makes me feel a lot better when I change things to know that I'm not breaking other things. Better filtering of the fellowships page, which I can already mention. Another thing that I have almost got implemented is a way to mass upload fellowship listings from like an Excel spreadsheet or CSV file. Because right now Cole has like a huge backlog of fellowships we want to add to the page, but it's a big pain to add them one at a time. Other things that are just kind of bugging me are that I want to improve the speed of the to-do list page. Like, there's a few users we have who have like 300 to 400 tasks on their to-do list page, and right now the way it's implemented, it kind of lags when you have a lot of tasks. The mobile site is another place I really want to improve, especially because like phones are such a popular way to access the internet, and it's really hard, as I think Kent's Ruby on Rails team has discovered, to build for both a desktop version and a mobile version at the same time. Especially something like that to-do list, because the whole way that the interface works would have to change, because you can't really have like 3 columns next to each other on an iPhone. So if anybody has any ideas about a better UI experience, let me know. And then, like I said, to deal with the fact that people are adding fake email addresses, very obviously fake email addresses. So that should be a quick fix. because there's another way that I already send mailers to users. I just haven't done it. Right, and so I am planning to pursue a full-time position after I graduate, but I have every intention of staying very involved with Brioxy. And so because of that, we are looking for a summer intern to continue working on some of these features. And so I'm going to follow up with an email later with a lot more details about this, but we're looking for somebody who can work for about 30 hours per week from June 1st to August 15th. We would be able to pay you like a $5,000 stipend for your time and work. And I'm thinking it would involve like weekly check-ins with me, where we can talk about like why I implemented things in a weird way that I did, and we can like brainstorm bugs and features and things like that. And also sometimes with Cole to just like talk about the direction of the site, which is really cool to talk to. And so nice qualifications would be that you've worked on like at least one significant project. It doesn't have to be Rails, but like having worked on like Android projects was a huge help in getting started with this project. So that's a really useful experience to have had to kind of take on this kind of work. You'd be working on your own a lot, which can get kind of lonely, like not gonna lie. So you kind of need to be self-directed and good about asking questions just to kind of clarify what it is you like. Because Cole is almost like a client who doesn't have like a ton of technical experience, so what she's saying she wants might be different than what you understand. So like being able to just ask a lot of questions and to like communicate technical things in a non-technical way is really important. And ideally we're looking for somebody who'd be able to stay in the Bay Area over the summer, just so that weekly check-ins would be easier. So I will send out an email soon, and we're hoping to sit down and talk with anybody who's interested sometime next week. Time permitting, I was going to talk about what it was like to co-found a startup, but I don't think time is permitting.
Should we say anyone who needs to leave can?
Yeah, or I can kind of losing my voice, so that might limit it too. But if you want to hear about what it was like to start a startup, I'm happy to talk at length about that one-on-one. This is hosted online, and I listed a bunch of the resources that I use. This is not a comprehensive list, but if anybody wants to check it out, I can give you the link to that. So yeah, that is what I've been working on for the last year. Any questions?
How confident did you feel starting out? You said you hadn't done.
It took a long time, and it definitely took a long time to start to feel like I really understood how all these features work together, and I definitely still feel like I'm learning. What happened a lot at the beginning is I would look at examples of other people who had implemented things that I was trying to do, and I would copy things more than I should have without totally understanding like what they did, which is never a good way to go, but it's very tempting. But it ultimately comes around because usually that part that you copied ends up breaking later on down the road, and you really have to understand it. So that actually is a great way to learn when you have things come back to haunt you. Testing also really helped me to feel a lot more confident, because for a while I would push a change to production and just like wait for something terrible to happen. So testing and adding a staging site, so like a separate kind of like clone of the site where I could push changes to make sure that when I pushed it to the remote servers on Heroku, like everything still worked okay. Because that would happen a lot where I would like test everything on my local machine and it would be fine, and then I'd be like, okay, I'm going to push it to production, and then I'm not going to look at my computer, and then I would get a text from Cole being like, this thing is not working at all. So that's because there were several different kinds of bugs that came between the local version and the production version of the site. So having a staging site was a good addition. So things like that made me a lot more confident. Any other questions?
Just a question about the using Ruby on Rails. You said Rails is a nice framework to start out with, mostly because it's easy to do, but that at some point it's not as friendly, especially if the site becomes too large and there's too many users. When it gets to that point, what do you do?
Well, I mean, so there's a lot of debate about whether or not that's even true, that like Rails doesn't scale well. I know it's something that a lot of people have said. Like probably the most famous example of a like startup that got really big and started in Rails and had to switch was Twitter. Because they used Rails until I think like 2011, and then it kept, like, because Rails gets a lot of traffic, and like Twitter gets a lot of traffic, and it like really started to slow things down in 2011, and I think they switched, I think there's still parts of their code base that are written in Rails, but they switched to a lot of like Scala, however you pronounce that, and which is just a little faster of a language than Ruby. So, remember what your original question was?
Just about Rails and how
Yeah.
it doesn't, I think you answered.
Yeah,
the
so
question.
I know that's what some companies have had to do, they've had to switch, but then again, there's a lot of like very popular sites that have grown and are still able to use Rails, like I think Airbnb still uses Rails, and like Groupon uses Rails, like there's a lot of like big sites that still use Rails, it just kind of depends on their needs as they get bigger.
So I guess for a small non-profit site, I guess Ruby on Rails is perfect.
Yeah, especially because I can't foresee, even if it got to be like the like have the market shares in that nonprofit environment, I just don't think it would end up with the kind of traffic it would have on like Twitter. So yeah, I mean, I haven't encountered any problems with it so far, but it depends on what site you have.
Have you encountered any security risks with your site, seeing that it's live and all?
Like, has anyone tried to hack the site or anything like that?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know that we're like, I don't think that enough people know about us to where we would really be of interest to a hacker, and there's not really any information other than like people's potentially fake email addresses that can be like acquired from our site. That's something that I do want to look into, like tightening security later on down the road, especially because Cole long term, once we have like more robust features, wants to have like a premium version and a free version of the site, which would involve like more commerce and things like that, and that's when I think you really need to start worrying about security. But there are like sites like Stripe and other startups that will kind of offload the like actual financial transactions, so you don't have as much responsibility for them. So I looked into that a little bit, and I think Stripe is probably what we would use if we ever like wanted to start charging people for stuff. Any other questions?
In terms of, I guess, I saw like a lot of like logistical support. In terms of, I guess, emotional support, pep talk for like people, I was just curious if there's like content or what kind of the direction with that on the site, if there's, because I know there's like stuff with like opportunities and task lists and stuff. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Is that what the videos were about, or?
Yeah, and also, like, I think that's a great question, and I think that's what, because right now the site doesn't do that much. That, like, there's competitors that do a lot of what we're doing. Like, there's a million like time management systems out there. There's like a million to-do lists. I think mine looks prettier. And there's like other ways you can look up fellowships, but I think that what really has a lot of potential for Brioxy is Cole's ability to like cultivate a community. So just adding ways for like people to talk to each other on the site and to talk about fellowships. That was kind of that like Yelp type component. So like within each detail page for a fellowship, like just having a conversation about that fellowship. And Cole also just has a tremendous network of people who have won fellowships and opportunities, who she says she can get to kind of be like the resident expert for that fellowship, to be like very active, like kind of almost like the owner of that fellowship, to like give people advice and to like maybe do blog posts. So really implementing, I think that's like our biggest focus for the summer, is implementing that way for like people to like actually communicate on the site. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Have you looked into integrating an existing content management system?
For
For
the discussion type
Yeah.
thing, yeah, I looked at like discuss, and a few other things like that, or even just for,
Content to
right,
to
so
edit
like for
content for the
uploading. Yeah,
yeah,
that.
for the non-technical.
Yeah, I did, I looked at them a lot.
Yeah.
I actually tried out a few, like there's a content management system called like Comfy Mexican Sofa, like CMS. I don't know why.
You try them?
I tried it and it was just, like again, that's kind of similar to the like authorization thing where I did it on my own, and part of that was just because it was a lot less code that I was adding to the project, and because at that point it wasn't that much that we're trying to upload, but that still might be something that we want to add later on. So far it hasn't been too much of a problem, but I definitely thought about that. Any other questions? Oh, okay.